Welcome to Web Development Lesson 7.1. In this video, we're going to see how we can use functions as part of the web development process for more than just event handlers. In doing so, we're going to explore two software development concepts called refactoring and modular programming. Now, refactoring is just the process of taking an existing piece of code and then changing its structure, but not changing its output. So we're going to take advantage of functions to restructure an existing example to simply produce the same output. In doing so, we're going to be using a technique called modular programming. Now, modular programming is very useful because it takes a big application, a big program, and you develop it by developing smaller functions and then have them work together to produce the final solution. Again, this makes troubleshooting easier as well as maintaining and updating. So let's get to it. So let's start off by looking at the example that we're looking to replicate or refactor. So in a previous video, we covered how we can pull JSON information from NYC Open Data. This particular data set is the 311 complaints service calls. The code to produce that, it's not much, but we're still going to use it as an example of refactoring. So you can see here we pull the data, and because it's an array of JSONs, and just to show you that, let's go ahead and grab the data. Again, if you're new to this particular video, if it's been a while since you've seen data from NYC Open Data, it returns an array of JSONs. All right, so this is what we're dealing with. So when we pull the data from our local file, it's an array of JSONs, which then requires us to use a for loop to go through every single element in the array, and then pull that JSON element, and then use that to produce the card. So again, this is the process we're looking to refactor using modular programming. So the first process we want to actually simplify is this one. Again, if you've been doing web development for a while, you will find that this is a very common command to use. So it'd be nice for us to maybe simplify this process and not have to type this over and over again. So going to our example, and just to show you we have nothing else here, let's take a modular approach to solving the same problem. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to simplify that process of using document get element by ID. And we're going to do that by creating a function that will be passed an ID, and then it will simply use that document get element by ID with that ID that was passed into us as the parameter and return the element. So this is actually going to return an element to wherever the get function was called. So let's go ahead and test out this little piece of code. So let's say output equals get output. Now to test this out to make sure that this is working, we should be able to do this now if we truly did get the element. We use the classic hello world. All right, so we see that the hello world pops up in our output element, letting us know that the get function is performing its job. All right, so now let's move a little further into the process. So in this, we use the for loop to produce cards on the web page. So let's simplify this process first by simply taking the process that's inside the for loop and making this a function. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this because we're going to need it. And let's go to our helper function. And let's create a function card whose sole purpose is to produce a card. Still a little cleaning up. Let's create that variable build. All right, so as you can see here, in order for this function to do its job, it needs that JSON that we had in the previous example, which was pulled from the data array. But the function shouldn't really care where the JSON is coming from. So we're simply going to write this, complaints. And what this is going to do, this is a parameter that's simply going to accept the JSON from the main program. Now, a common mistake that students have when writing functions that return information is that they get so caught up in completing the process that they forget to return the information. So let's do that before we forget. So let's return build. Now let's go back to our main program and test this out. Now we could simply do output dot inner HTML equals card. So let's try to produce one card to the screen. So again, recall the card function needs a JSON. Now the JSONs are located in this array called data. So to get the first element as a way of testing, we're simply going to do data bracket 0. Now this is the other thing that modular programming allows you to do. It allows you to test specific functions simply to make sure that that function is doing its job correctly. When you write huge programs, you still could use that idea of testing as you go, but it's definitely a lot easier when the process is broken down into functions. All right, so you can see here we did get the first card. I'm just kind of curious if it's the same first card as over here. It might not be because these two examples might be used in different data sets, but that's okay. It's still the idea that it is a 311 call being produced on the card. All right, so now we're ready to kind of produce the whole web page of cards for every single complaint that's listed in our data. So to do that, we're going to create another function called cards. And the job of cards is simply to take in all those complaints, that data, and then produce cards for each of them. So it's essentially this last step here of the for loop. But I want to start off with the concept that we're going to, again, accept complaints. And honestly, I probably should have called this complaint because there's not multiple complaints up here. And I'm going to do that just so that there is a distinction between these two functions. So card accepts one complaint, where cards accepts the array of complaints. Now, because we're going to be doing some building, we're going to put the build variable here as well. And because complaints will be that array of JSONs, we're going to need to use a for loop. I less than complaints dot length, and then we'll do I plus plus. Now, here's where you're going to see something real nice because of the fact that we've already taken a modular approach to building this particular web page. So the job of cards is to build cards from these individual elements. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call the card function. So this is one function calling this function. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to pass in one of the JSONs from this array of complaints. Now, just as a way to compare, this is essentially the same thing we're doing over here. Notice we're still going through the array of data, and we're pulling the individual JSONs and then using them as part of the card. And that's what we've done here. This pulls one of the JSONs from the array of JSONs and then sends it to the card function, which then produces the card, which then sends it back to here, and then builds it as part of this variable. Now, like I said earlier, don't get too excited about completing the process and forget to actually return the information. All right, so let's test this out. Let's go here. And what we can do is, hopefully, if there are no syntax errors, is to output in HTML equals cards. Now recall, what does cards need? Cards need an array of JSONs. Now, looking over here, well, that's what our variable data represents. It represents an array of JSON. So I'm simply going to take this whole array, pass it into the function cards, and let cards do its job. And let me just go ahead and actually let me pop it open to a new page. And as you can see here, we now have cards for every single complaint. Essentially the same output that we had here, minus the fact that it's a different data set. And just to kind of bring this a little bit more to home, I'm going to restructure this code just a little bit. Technically, I could have done this. Oops. Get output .init.html. Now, let's compare the code that's inside the init function here as compared to the code inside here. Again, this code looks a lot busier. This code looks a lot cleaner. Again, it simply says, I'm going to get the output and I'm going to produce cards for each piece of data. Now, in the end, we can't forget the fact that the work has to be done. And the work is being done by the functions. So this cannot be replaced. The only thing that we're doing here is that we're changing the structure of the program. All right, so let's go back to our presentation and let's review what we've done. So in this video, we explored two software development concepts called refactoring and modular program, which use the concept of functions to restructure code and restructure code in such a way that a big task is broken down into smaller tasks that can be joined together to create the whole solution. So hopefully you're excited about writing beautiful code and enjoy.